Welcome to Channel 17, the Town of Colonie Government Channel.
Hello and welcome to Focus on Health. I'm your host, Peggy Mello. Today's guest is Donna Lochner, a licensed mental health counselor who practices in Albany. Donna, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Peggy.
Today we're talking about grief. Why don't we start with a definition?
Grief is a psychological response to loss that also incorporates physical, mental, and emotional symptoms. To grieve is to heal.
And there are many types of loss that can cause grief in a person.
Yes.
Of course, one of them that we may be covering the most today would be death, the loss of a loved one.
Absolutely. There's death of a spouse, which is one of the most stressful events of someone's life. And actually, it was interesting for me to note that women are most likely to become widows in their early to mid 50s, which is pretty young. Divorce, miscarriage, infertility, loss of a job, aging, children going off to college, all of those involve losses, and whenever there's a loss, there is a bit of a grieving process.
I was also thinking the loss of a pet.
Yes.
Or if you're diagnosed with an illness where you think you're going to have a hard, difficult recovery.
Sure, yes. So really, anything that requires us as human organisms to adapt to change because there's loss involved will create a grief process. Usually, as you said, we do think more about death, divorce, those kinds of things, because they tend to be very, very significant losses.
Right. And let's talk about some of the symptoms of grief.
Symptoms actually fall into three categories: physical, mental, and emotional, and many of them overlap with symptoms of depression. So some of the things a grieving person might experience are things like fatigue, restlessness, heart palpitations, sweating, loss of sex drive.
Loss of sleep, I assume.
Loss of sleep because of difficulty with sleeping. Things like difficulty concentrating, making decisions, focusing attention, fear, sorrow, anger, rage, helplessness, loneliness, a whole host of symptoms. Actually, one of the ones that frequently happens that people get nervous about because they think it's odd is actually feeling like the deceased person is talking to them, is sitting next to them, is around them. That's a very common response. It's not crazy.
And I have a friend who lost her mother to cancer, who really feels as if her mother is with her, talking to her, possibly influencing events in her life.
And that can actually be a very healing experience for people, but they worry that it's crazy, and people will come in and say, oh, I'm going to tell you this one thing, and you're going to think it's crazy, but it's common.
Every day and every hour and maybe every minute is different. Up and down, like
that
a roller
is really
coaster.
A roller coaster is a great way to think about grief. For many people, it can feel kind of sad but relatively stable during some hours or days, and then right out of the blue, someone might have a very strong grief reaction, feel totally preoccupied with the loss, be crying uncontrollably, feeling like they can't function, and then that can pass in an hour. And then they can feel kind of back on target. And I think that one of the things that's difficult is it is so unpredictable, that there are feelings that come and go. And I often hear my clients say things like, I thought I was over this. I thought I was dealing really well, and then I had this moment of extreme grief. And there's actually a term that Therese Rando, who's a researcher and pioneer in the grief field, came up with, and the acronym is STUGS, Sudden Temporary Upsurges of Grief. And those are things where you could be in the supermarket and be feeling perfectly fine, and perhaps your husband has died, and you go down the coffee aisle and you see a can of his favorite coffee, and boom, right out of the blue, you feel like someone stabbed you in the gut. You feel an overwhelming sense of sadness and numbness and just feeling like you can't even think straight. That's a stug. And it's important to know about that because they do happen, and it is part of the normal grieving process.
Now, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross and Death and Dying. Do you want to talk about her stages of grief?
Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's stages of death and dying, which many people are familiar with, they are denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, when she wrote her book back in 1969, what she had been researching was not the experience of grief, but the experience of a person being told that they had a terminal illness. And her 5 stages really applied to what happens to people when they are terminally ill and trying to come to terms with that.
So when they're diagnosed with cancer or something to that effect.
Or they get some sort of catastrophic health news. So somehow over the years, Kubler-Ross's stages got propagated and morphed into the grief stages. And that's a real misnomer. Because the stages or the tasks of healing from grief are somewhat different than Kubler-Ross's 5 stages, and she never intended her work to be used to describe the grief process. So the 4 tasks, Warden, who's another pioneer and researcher, came up with these. One way to think about the 4 tasks is with an acronym called TEAR, T-E-A-R. T being to accept the reality of the loss, E being to experience the pain of the loss. Sometimes in the psychotherapeutic community we call that working with the grief work. A is adjusting to the new environment, which can mean things like, say a woman loses her husband. He paid all the bills, he drove the car, he put gas in the car. So adjusting would be her taking on roles that she hasn't previously taken on. And the last stage, R, is reinvesting or reorganization. And basically what that means is going from a stage of feeling really disorganized to kind of reorganizing your life. Reinvesting your energy means being able to free up the energy that's been used to deal with the grief process and use that towards new endeavors, new activities, new people in your life. It's not about forgetting about the lost item or person. It's just about freeing up that energy to move ahead, to create new things in one's life.
And these aren't done together all at the same time.
Absolutely.
They're separate stages. And you can't really set a time frame on how long each one would take.
Yes. One of the things that is important, the reason that I mentioned Kubler-Ross and why we don't want to use her 5 stages, first of all, the stages are a little bit different than the tasks of grieving. Secondly, the stages of Kubler-Ross give people the idea that there is a set and ordered way of going through the grief process. There is nothing further from the truth. Not everyone gets angry. Some people feel relief and upset. Not everybody bargains. And we've heard of people who have had loved ones who have been frustrated with the grieving person because they're not going through the stages like they're supposed to. So that's why we call them tasks of grieving. And those tasks pretty much need to happen, but they're not necessarily in any predictable or set order. And the other thing that we've been finding in the last few years. We used to think that the grief process lasted for about a year. What we believe is that the most intense and acute period of grieving tends to last 6 to 12 months. But the grieving process with some of the more significant losses can last up to 3 to 5 years. Now, that's the good news and the bad news, because people think, oh, I don't want to be feeling like this for 5 years, but it does diminish somewhat over time.
Mm-hmm.
But the good news is, for many people who do take 3 or 4 years to recover from a divorce or from death of a spouse
Mm-hmm.
or death of a sibling, that's normal. Because people are often really concerned about what's normal. I'm having these experiences. I'm feeling numb and disconnected.
Mm-hmm.
I can't concentrate. I'm thinking about the deceased all the time. But that's normal.
I would think that if you compare the difference between, let's say, the loss of a loved one and divorce, and you think about the person's items are still in the house, well, I would think it'd be a lot harder to get rid of the items of someone who actually passed away and someone you were divorced from.
In some ways, it can be easier for someone to die than to become terminally ill and have to take care of them, or to be divorced. And what's funny is, even though the divorce rate for the first marriage is roughly 50% and roughly 60 to 62% for second marriages,
Wow.
divorce is a pretty, I was going to say popular, pretty common experience, but that doesn't make it any easier.
Right.
And what is particularly interesting about divorce is that not only are you losing your marriage and your partner, you're losing a standard of life, you're losing your role as a spouse,
Yeah.
you're losing the people in your life who were perhaps couple friends, your relationship
Yes.
with your extended family changes, your relationships with your children change. You
Yeah.
don't see your children all the time. Birthdays, holidays, weddings, and graduations will never be the same as
Right.
they would have been with an intact couple.
And I would think that you're going to be, most of the stress would be dealing with the children's sense of loss and
Well, that's a big source of stress.
the difficult process of sharing.
Yes, very difficult. And I have to say, having been divorced, two of the things that I really experienced were what I sort of created this because this came from my experiences, the loss of rights. Like when I would call my husband's office, I was the wife. I always got through. I was the most important person. Now if I have to call him for something, I'm just like anybody else who calls. I don't have any special, unique status. And the other is loss of what I call memory. For some people, their spouses hold memory of events. That was true in my marriage, that I could always go to my husband and say, when we were talking about something that we were going to do with my mother in the future, what did we say? Because he remembered everything. He was my memory. And so that was a huge loss, that I couldn't go to him and say, when did this happen and when did this important thing transpire? So there's a lot of what we call secondary losses that go along with primary losses like divorce, death, etc.
And I guess one of the points in all of this recovery process is to not isolate yourself and to not be alone inside of your house.
You know, it's funny. Isolation that is a, quote, bad thing is when we cut ourselves off from other people, we don't allow them to support us, we try to carry our pain by ourselves. But then there are times when any of us need time alone, that we need time to process things, where we don't have outside input and outside stimulation. But if you're talking about isolation in terms of feeling like I'm self-sufficient and I don't need anybody and I can carry this myself, no, that is generally not useful. That it is important for people to be able to reach out, get support. And some of the other things that are useful are, for example, having someone that you can talk to who's not going to speak platitudes like, oh, he's in a better place, or, oh, you'll get over this, or, I don't know what you're so upset about, he was old and sick anyway, or God would never give you more than you could handle. Those are platitudes. And people use platitudes because they're uncomfortable, because they don't know how to deal with strong emotion.
Well, I have to say that the thought of attending a wake or a funeral is very uncomfortable for me,
Yeah.
because I really inside don't know what to say to this person, you know,
Yeah.
and you talk to them afterwards and you don't want to bring up the loss because maybe their mind isn't on it.
Well,
You
know,
don't want to
that's-
get them to start thinking about it.
That's a common misconception. People usually want to talk about the loss, and one of the things that tends to be helpful is definitely bring up the lost person. Share memories that you have about that person. Allow the grieving person to talk as much as they want, to tell stories over and over again. And while we sometimes think, well, I don't want to bring it up, I don't want to upset them, believe me, they're already thinking about it. And having it brought up actually can be really helpful and healing. And that's one of the reasons why at services after wakes, people usually spend time sharing their memories, the experiences they had, what they valued about the deceased person, and that can be really healing to a griever.
And unfortunately, in our culture, it's not a ritual. I mean, it can be a ritual on Father's Day or Mother's Day or their birthday,
Yeah.
Christmas, but
Well, that's one of the reasons why I think that funeral rites and funeral rituals and wakes are so important, because it gives people an opportunity to see and touch, if they want to, say goodbye to the person who's died, to be able, my grandmother died in January of this year, and I traveled down to Virginia to be with family, and I found it so satisfying to be able to, I put a special stone in her pocket, I touched her and I spoke to her and I kissed her, and I was one of the people who eulogized her. And part of that was remembering who she was as a person, what things I had gotten from her, what things I had learned from her that aren't skills that I have that I really wanted to take on. And I found the service to be extremely satisfying because we all talked about what she meant to us, we shared stories, and in terms of ritual, one of the things that I did on that day is I wore jewelry that she had given me.
yeah.
And I said to my friend who was there with me, just for today, I'm going to practice flexibility and adaptability, which are not two of my strengths, but were my grandmother's strengths. And those were ways of memorializing, of being with, and it was a very, very satisfying funeral experience. I also sang a song at the gravesite, a spiritual song, and all of those were sort of rituals and moments of honoring her life.
I think that would be easy to think about, and a fantastic approach, but does it all depend on how you feel that day? If all you want to do is cry, then how are you
Yes.
going to be able to sing, or how are you going to be able to do a eulogy?
Yes, so it's important to really respect whatever your own process is. If you're feeling really like you're just going to break down and sob, break down and sob. It's perfectly appropriate to do that at a funeral. And I think it's important to listen to what your insides say that they want to do. That was useful to me. There were other people who eulogized her, and there was such a feeling of connection, of being together with a group of people who all loved this same person.
What do you think are the differences in gender, and how we express grief or how we deal with it?
At the risk of stereotyping, there's a tendency that women tend to have what we call more of an intuitive response. Women are more likely to cry and to want to talk about the person or the event, the loss. Men tend to take things inside more, mull them over inside, and they have what we call more of an instrumental approach. For example, a man who's lost his father is more likely to go out and chop wood if his father was a wood chopper, or to do something active to honor his father, or to be more physically active just to release some of the energy of the grief. So men tend not to talk as much or cry as much, but that's not true of all men.
But I can't imagine what it does to your insides.
I think there was a time when we believed that if men didn't talk or cry, that it was harmful to them. But what we have come to find out is that they have other ways. Their style is different of coping. And it isn't necessarily a bad thing unless they completely close themselves down and won't allow themselves to feel. But that's true of women too.
I would imagine that it's more difficult to get a man into a support group. A grief support group would be a woman.
In the whole psychotherapeutic community, men have never shown up in the numbers that women have for any kind of counseling support groups. That's just pretty much a fact of the numbers of women versus the numbers of men who show up.
I think what's also interesting, and this is discussed in some of the books that we're going to be talking about later on, is the cultural differences of dealing with a loss. I know I have a friend who is Chinese who honors his father, I think 6 times a year, and gets together with his family and does a particular ritual. I just love the idea of it. I do.
Even families will create different rituals, and the important thing is whatever is meaningful to the griever or meaningful to the family. There is no grieving ritual that is bad or wrong. It really depends on what feels right to you on the inside. Some people, for example, will, if they have a family member who is cremated, they may wear some of the ashes in a locket. We call that a keepsake or a linking object, a way of staying connected. There are times when people will do a ritual where they might set up an altar with objects that remind them of the deceased person and light a candle and read a poem, or someone might make a special meal that the deceased person really liked, or include at holidays or celebrations a plate in honor of this person. I think there are lots of ways that we ritualize. It could be going to the cemetery and having a conversation or bringing flowers. But whatever is meaningful to the griever is really the best way to go about using ritual.
But I think we all have our own opinions of what is appropriate and what isn't, and we can't judge anyone.
Yeah.
But I met a person a few months ago who had lost her husband a year before that and was wearing his clothes. So I know you can't really define what is appropriate and what isn't, because it depends on the person.
It is. Appropriate really, for the most part, is in the eye of the beholder. And I wouldn't necessarily be concerned about someone wearing her husband's clothing from a mental health perspective, from assessing someone. I think what we most look at is, to what degree does this person's functioning, to what degree is this person's functioning working for them? I mean, if she's wearing her husband's clothes but she's able to function in the world, so be it.
Right. So what about maybe just tips for daily living with someone that suffered a loss?
Well, I want to just before I respond to that, I just want to say there are certain kinds of losses that lead to more complicated and difficult grief processes. And some of those are things like, for example, loss of a child. That's nature backwards, actually, because we never think that our children will die before us.
Children.
Another is if a death happens as a result of violence or suicide or a crime.
Right.
Those tend to be more traumatic experiences. And if you're the mourner, if you have a history of significant losses, you will most likely have more difficulty dealing with grief because grief is cumulative. And you might have noticed that when someone dies, it brings up the pain of everyone else in your life who has died. If you are experiencing personal problems at the time of someone's death, that will complicate the grieving. If you were having an estranged relationship, like people who don't speak to a sibling or a parent for years and years and then the person dies, that really complicates the grieving and makes it much more difficult. But in terms of steps or general kinds of ideas for helping yourself, certainly reaching out for support, having people that you can talk to about your experience, that you can talk endlessly if need be about stories about the lost item or person, really paying attention to your basic self-care, getting enough rest. Grieving is a very exhausting process. Eating well, continuing to get exercise, not expecting yourself to have a lot of energy or to be able to take on major changes in the first few months. Really coming to recognize what is normal, that all of the kind of weird experiences and the up and down feelings are normal. Having some sort of ritual, honoring anniversaries. This is a big one. A lot of times the death anniversary, the person's, if it was your mother, Mother's Day, the person's birthday, really tends to bring up emotion, and people generally aren't prepared for that. So preparing for the fact that anniversary dates will be difficult, holidays, particularly during the first year, and sort of preparing for that in a way where you cut yourself some additional slack, you allow yourself more support during that time, you might do things that are more comforting, like curling up in a cozy blanket, taking a bath, being very gentle to yourself, recognizing that grieving takes as long as it takes, that there is no standard amount of time. Those are some of the things that are helpful for people when they're grieving.
And I can vouch for our library's collection of materials as well. Do you want to talk about some of the books that we have? The first one that you mentioned to me was the Grief Recovery Handbook.
Yes, yes. And I know you have that. I think you have it in hard copy also. The Grief Recovery book is a really easy to read, succinct, simple book that I think is a really nice overview, gives some helpful suggestions. Some of the other, How to Go on Living When Someone You Love Dies by Therese Rando, that's another really helpful book. Therese is someone who really usually writes for the psychotherapeutic community, and this is one of her first mass market books, but it's very user-friendly. There are books on children and grief and loss, which I think it's really difficult for parents when they're having their own grief experience to be able to know, how do I help my child? What's appropriate? Do I have them go to this service or not? So I see you have books by Warden, who is another pioneer in the field, Doka, on disenfranchised grief. I'll mention what disenfranchised grief is because that's tends to lead to more complications. Basically what that means is any grief experience that is not really recognized by society or sanctioned. It's if your husband dies or your child dies, there's a ceremony.
You'll
there
get a
are
casserole.
flowers. Somebody will send you a casserole. But if you are, for example, let's say your ex-spouse dies, or your boss dies, or you're a gay or lesbian person and your partner dies, or you've had an affair with someone and they die.
Right.
Those are not the kinds of things that most people will recognize and pay attention to. You won't get the kind of support. People won't even be able to acknowledge that those are important losses. Miscarriage
Interesting.
is a really common disenfranchised loss. Most women who miscarry hear things like, oh, it was for the better, the child probably would have had problems anyway, you can have more children, you hardly knew him anyway. And women who miscarry can have tremendous amounts of grief. They have formed a feeling of love and attachment to the growing fetus. They have had dreams. They might have chosen a name.
Oh, yeah.
And so many people don't really take seriously some of the kinds of losses that can be very painful.
Okay, and then you have a website we wanted to mention, counselingforloss.com. Okay, so we have a number of resources. Now, the other thing that these books have is a number of organizations for and the contact information for them. Also, further reading if anyone wants to continue onward in their quest for books. Of course, we have an interlibrary loan process as well at the library. If we don't own something, we can get it for them.
And books can be very, very helpful. They're informative, they're
Right.
supportive, and sometimes if people are really struggling, they may decide they want to see a mental health professional. And you know what's funny is there's a misconception that people who see mental health professionals are crazy. And I was saying to you before we taped today that the vast majority of people who see a therapist are not crazy. And sometimes even just having a few sessions to sort out, to process some of the experiences and the feelings, and being able to get a sense of what's normal. I've frequently had people who've come in and said, okay, you are going to think this is really weird. I feel the deceased person sitting on my bed, talking to me, sitting in the car next to me. I know that's the weirdest thing you ever heard. I hear this over and over again. This is a normal kind of experience. And part of healing is understanding that what you're going through is expected and that there's nothing odd about it.
Well, thank you very much for coming. We're going to have you back for a third show. We've already done dealing with difficult people. Now this is grief, and then we're going to be doing emotional eating, hopefully soon in the future. Thanks very much for coming, Donna.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for watching. We hope to see you next time on Focus on Health.
Welcome to Channel 17, the Town of Colonie Government Channel.